Good afternoon. We want to welcome you to the plenary session of our discussion on civil discourse. My name is Sean Hughes, and I am proud to introduce our speaker for the day. Dr. David Roach was here, I believe, before he was Dr. David Roach. I could be wrong, but he was here for a short period of time in the 80s. And I was privileged to have him as a professor in the communication department. And I will say that I still remember some of the final exams he gave. He was a very, very difficult exam giver and really was a tough teacher, but he was such a fair teacher. And he did such a great job of encouraging us that everybody enjoyed his classes. And I won't say we always enjoyed the paper writing, but it prepared me for graduate school, and so it was well received in the end. I'll share one small anecdote, which I have many, but I do remember about 3 years or 4 years later, out of the blue, I called Dr. Roach at Texas Tech. At this point in time, I had done radio for a couple of years, and I was thinking of going back to study at Tech. And so I called him, and I said, Dr. Roach, I know you don't remember me. My name's Sean Hughes. And he goes, Sean, hi, how are you? And just right away, he has such a great memory, but that also speaks to his connection that he makes with his students and with his friends and with the people that are around him. Later on, he served as the chair of my thesis for my master's, and I really enjoyed working closely with him. Dr. Roach has a bachelor's and master's from Abilene Christian University. His doctoral degree is from Texas Tech. He is a professor of communication. He was a faculty member at West Virginia University before coming to Lubbock to be a faculty member at Texas Tech University. He served as the basic course director for oral communication courses and the chair of the Communication Studies Department at Texas Tech for 10 years. Currently, he serves as the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in the College of Arts and Sciences at Texas Tech. In his free time, he enjoys analyzing, making, arranging, studying, and performing music. He says music communicates the heart and life in a manner that is deeper than words. And then when asked what he would like LCU students to know about him, he says, pursue God with all of your heart and might, no matter what you encounter in life. Dr. David Roach.
Well, good afternoon. It's such a blessing to be here. What a family of scholars and of Christians that you have at Lubbock Christian. What a blessing. What a blessing. I'm so glad to be here this afternoon, and I'm glad that Dr. Blassingame asked me to speak on civil discourse, this whole series that you're doing. And I pointed up there, but it's not up there. Thinking critically about civil discourse. What a powerful series. And what a very time-relevant series to have. And so I was so honored. You know, who could say no to Dr. Blassingame coming to this? She's so gracious. How could you tell her no? But when she said, I want you to come talk about civil discourse, I thought, oh my word, I cannot resist that topic. What a powerful topic. And you've heard from some really, really neat people already. From Dr. Boston and Martin and Hughes and Privet and Perez so far. And then next week, maybe not next week, the next one is going to be Dr. Privet, Byers, and Carroll to come. So what a great and grand lineup you have of people to make comment on this particular topic. You know, I couldn't resist the topic because there's so much not civil discourse. And I thought there's so much not of it that I thought I just must go and spend some time exploring some of these things with you. So my topic today, I thought, well, if we're going to look at civil discourse, why don't we look at uncivil discourse, because that seems to be the problem. And so what I wanted to do today is to look at the context of uncivil discourse and then maybe to explore some ways that we could remedy it. How can we find a way to deal with this? So I want to look at some alternatives to uncivil discourse that maybe we can explore together, and maybe we can find a way to not do the uncivil part of it. I ran across a poem after the last election, and I thought I would just start out today sharing that poem with you because I thought it was so powerful. I'll just read it. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. Great poem written by Anonymous for the last election. Or was it? Was that the poet laureate? Or perhaps that was Charles Dickens. And perhaps it wasn't about the last election. Perhaps it was about the French Revolution. Or frankly, as we mentioned in chapel, it could have been AD 0 through 70. Some of the discord and the tumultuous times we have, there's not much new under the sun. This has happened before. I think there may be some characteristics about this time around that may be a little bit different. But we live in uncivil times, and there's some contextual things that go with that. And so I want us to look to start out with, to talk a little bit about what is the context of the times that we live in, and where do we see incivility around us. You know, I know all of us have different political persuasions, but the older I get, sometimes some things surprise me. And I think over the last few years, some signs of incivility that I had never seen before about the president. Have any of you seen pictures like this about a president of our country, whether you voted for this person or not? I was a little bit shocked to see things like this in our society. I was always raised, our president is our president, and you may not vote with them, you may not like what they do, but it's the president. And then I would see pictures like this, and I would think, oh my word, that's a bit incivil. And then I saw this one, and I thought, oh my word, that's a bit uncivil. And I thought in some ways, civil or civilization in some respects is kind of a thin veneer. And I hope we can protect that veneer, but what's below it is not very pretty. And so some people get to where they're so passionate or upset about whatever it is that might be going on in the presidential office. You see examples of incivility that are somewhat shocking. Other uncivil discourse that you may have seen recently in the elections, and you see people in the street yelling at each other and what have you. I thought you might enjoy this one. Berkeley doesn't know if they believe in free speech or if they don't. They really are having this debate with themselves, and those of you that may be old enough to remember, UC Berkeley was kind of the seat of free speech years ago, and now they're wondering if maybe that's not okay. I was so cracked up when I saw this news story. They were having riots on Berkeley and setting things on fire and what have you, and then a fight broke out in the empathy tent. It's got to be a problem when a fight breaks out in the empathy tent. And not only that, but it was a professor fighting in the empathy tent. And I thought, oh heavens, we live in times of incivility. And so you may say, and I'll have to quote a great poet on this, you look at all of this and you say, well, in the context of incivility that we live in, you might have a question. And the question might be this: well, how did I get here? Okay, now for some of you that are younger, that's just a bizarre older person thing I just did. For some of you that might, but I think it's a legitimate question. How did we get to a point where you might put something very denigrating about your president, whether you voted for him or not, or you're yelling in the streets, or you're setting things on fire, or breaking things, or whatever? I want us to explore just a little bit before we get to perhaps some alternatives that we could think about. How did we get to this point? Well, I would think in some respects, there are a few things that we could look at. And there's a whole big list of them, and I won't go through them real slowly. I'll go through them kind of quickly. I had a professor at Tech, the chair of the poli-sci department, say something to me I'd never thought of. And he said, used to we had election cycles that went every 4 years. And he said, and then we went to election cycles that went kind of every 2 years. It was a big deal. Until we went to election cycles that are continuous. They're never over. And I thought, that's a fascinating thing. So, frankly, if your candidate loses, you spend all your time between now and the next election fighting that and trying to get your person in. So it's never over. You never say, okay, well, we'll rest with this, whoever it is, for the next few years, and then we'll have another election. It's kind of like having Christmas stuff in the stores right now. Now, you can go to Fredericksburg, and they have a Christmas store down there, but it's like, can we leave the Christmas decorations out for just a little bit? Can we get past Thanksgiving and do some candy and all that and then go to that? So you see this continual bumping up of the cycles. Political ideologies, I don't know if there's anything new under the sun, but you'll see a lot more choruses about these. And there's some factors, I think, that amplify that chorus. We have different generations, not only in our society, but yea, verily, even in this room. The boomers are not like the millennials. They just aren't, all right? They come at the world from a different perspective. NESE is something, and I don't know if someone in here does admissions or whatever, but NESE is a national group that studies incoming freshmen every year, and they'll do a survey about what they're like religiously and what they care about and this and that. And I must admit, as I teach my classes and my hair gets more like this way instead of like yours, it used to be that color, almost that long. No! Tell me no! It's very nice. But, I'll say things in my class like, the other day I said, you remember 9/11? And somebody raised their hand and said, I was 2 years old. And I thought, oh heavens, I wasn't talking about Pearl Harbor or the American Revolution. I was old, I was here then, but I wasn't talking about that. And so you find people that come at things with a different reference, a different point of reference, and sometimes that can cause tension. Culture wars, racial conflicts. I ran across this concept right above that a little bit earlier, and I thought that was interesting. What is the era we're living in? Are we in a modernism era? Well, no, actually went past modernism. We went into postmodernism, and somebody shared this with me the other day, and I thought, no. And they said, yes. And I said, no. And they said, yes. And I looked it up. We're in the post-truth era now. And I thought, go Google it. And you'll find that we are now in the post-truth era, and there's some implications about that in terms of how we deal with one another, how we run for office, how we do a variety of things. We're in the post-truth era. Oh, heavens, I hope not. I would like to think there is truth, and I want to pursue it with my fiber of my being. There's violence all over the world. We have large groups of people trying to get away from it, which causes a lot of tensions between nations and continents. We have religious conflicts, inter-religious conflicts, intra-religious conflicts, macro and micro. This morning in chapel, one of the things that I didn't get to mention that I wanted to, isn't it interesting that a lot of the conflicts that you'll see in churches are over policy issues? Those policy issues, however, are driven by value issues, and that's why people get so upset about it sometimes. Because they think, well, no, this policy is driven by a value question, and that's why we need to do this or that. But I find that very, very interesting. Other contributing factors, I had to give this one its own slide. I think there's something new, maybe new, under the sun in terms of our ideological perspectives and some of the tensions we have now, some of which existed in AD 0 through 70. I think one of the differences that we have in our generation is that we have such technology and media that can spread all those things a lot quicker. You can look things up. I have this little thing that I very rarely use for a phone. I use it for everything else, all right, like to find my way around in the world and that sort of thing, to receive calls. that sort of thing, but not very often. I use it for a whole lot of other things. And so technology has an interesting amplification. It ramps up some of the pressures that you would see in that other list. And I think that's kind of interesting. Social media, instant messages, pictures, videos. My students all the time, I'll say, now what is this again? This little tweet thing? What is past tense of tweet? What is past perfect of tweet? Can you use tweet in a sentence? All right, so they teach me these things, and Snapchat and Instagram are not the same thing. I didn't know. I am faceless. I don't have a Facebook, but I am related to people that have a Facebook. So they tell me what is and what isn't. That's a question of fact. Instant messages, news media narratives. This is interesting. This is something that I noticed a few years ago. It just shocked the daylights out of me. You know, when you go on and you surf the internet, you know the difference between the suffixes of things that you search for? What is a .org typically? Something dot organization, right? And so you might have a business or the government or whatever. What is a .com? Commercial. What do you do when you're doing commercial? You're selling things. And I thought, I'd never thought of the news selling things. What does the news sell? It sells narratives. It tells stories and sells narratives. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Some people think, well, can you ever get bias out of the news? I don't know. Can you be totally objective, or do we always have some subjectivity to us? You know, we're kind of now in a me generation, and so everybody's taking selfies, right? And you can get the food like you want it. I have a complicated order. You know, I'd like this. I'd like a burrito, but I'd like you to leave off the wrap and the beans, and could you put fish in it instead? And it's like, after a while, it's not a burrito anymore, all right? So you just wonder, we have our own biases. You can get your news that way as well. If you like the stories that a particular network is telling, then you watch that news. If you like the other stories that another network is telling, you watch that news. And so even in our narratives, we have choices and we prefer that. And media will have a tendency to target us based on that, right? They'll say, this is our audience. We will run stories like this. Now, do you ever get on the news media like on your computer and just try to manipulate them? See a story you like and click, get out, click, get out, click, get out. It's like, run that more. They're tracking your clicks, all right? And so you may do things like that. Marketing, popular narratives, a lot of things that end up in media that I think a lot of times can lead towards a feeling of unrest or tension, if you will, because of that. I will put this in. Sometimes when I watch news media coverage, I'm thinking, is that really the way the world is? Or is there, are you really covering the lunatic fringe? You know, you're covering this or that. And most people aren't that way, maybe. And so I'm wondering if it's a distribution that looks like this, or if this is like a bot. Maybe it is. And I'm the little stick figure right in the middle, like the rest of you. We're just normal people. We're not extreme here. We're just right here trying to live our lives. And so I always wonder, you know, is what I see on the news really this or this or this, all right? I'm not sure, but I do know it has a tendency to have an effect. The media has effect on us, all those other pressures that have an effect on us. Wars, rumors of wars, does that sound familiar? All of those things create a sense that we're dealing with some new stuff, but on the other hand, there may not be anything new under the sun. It may be that it's just ratcheted up a bit, but I'll tell you what it does. It puts your teeth on edge, doesn't it? You know, do you get wound up about things? You get tense about things? You get worried about things? It makes you ready to explode. How many people have you met, politically or otherwise, that are like this right here? They're a volcano going somewhere to happen. And if you watch some of the panels that they'll put together on the news where they discuss different issues on climate change or not climate change, everywhere you find yourself on that spectrum, whatever it is, you put a bunch of people, there's usually 4 people on a panel, and they yell at each other the whole time and kind of explode at each other, and then sometimes use profanity at each other, and you're going, we're a society full of people sometimes going around like this. Is it any wonder Is it any wonder that we run into uncivil discourse at times? Because we're ready to explode. And you think, well, what is our purpose in discourse anyway? Well, I think sometimes we think it's to persuade, but at other times it's just really to vent, just to explode at somebody else, and then let's just raise the volume and see who can yell the loudest. That's probably not what we want. All right, so let's talk about something more pleasant, shall we? Instead of where we are, how did we get here? Let's talk about what can we do about it? How could we interact with one another in discourse and communication in some sort of a civil way as opposed to not? Now, civil, we have some Latin scholars in this room. I know we do. Civil, I need to mention this. Civil is like the word, like civil discourse is kind of like civilization. And civil is Latin for, I heard this the other day, it's Latin for, I use my turn signals when I drive, and I'm nice, relatively nice to most people. Isn't that kind of what it is? Okay, well, let's go a little bit deeper. What could be some alternatives to the uncivil discourse that we see around us? There are some neat things you're going to hear next week. Neat things from Dr. Privet, Byers, and Carroll about building up your arguments. I'm going to make the case that one of the things we need to do is to learn how to be argumentative. And you say, oh, wait, are you sure? Isn't that what we're already seeing? Well, not in the research literature. Here's something that I came across years ago, and I thought, oh, that looks exciting. A group of researchers, Rancer and Infante, came up with a concept that they called argumentativeness. And I thought, well, that's kind of a cool concept. Let's see what it means. Well, the definition is here. Argumentativeness is the trait that inclines an individual in some sort of communication situation to advocate a position on a controversial issue, and to take to task, yea, verily, if you want to say attack, the other position that the other person takes. Now, I want to be very quick and follow up with that and say that is not the same thing as yelling at them, doing what might be called ad hominem attacks, or yelling names at them and that sort of thing. There's a difference between argumentative people and verbally aggressive people. And in the research literature, in this argumentative literature, they'll be very quick to point out verbal aggression is when you make denigrating personal comments about the other person. That's verbal aggression. Now, I'm going to just see a show of hands. How many of you in here, let me just change the word. How many of you in here just love a good debate? Let me see. Raise your hand. Oh, yes. How many of you like go through brick walls to get away from controversy? Like you drive, okay, I'm seeing it. You didn't want to raise your hand. You're afraid it would hurt somebody's feelings. Okay. You are gracious people. You are gracious people. You know, some of you in here, hey, let's just pick something to argue about. Which side do you want today? Well, I'll take this side. Okay, let's go. And you have a good time. My brother-in-law and I used to do that. We would argue for 2 hours and have the blast doing it. And our wives would say, stop talking, come eat. It's time to eat. Stop it. Oh, we were having so much fun. Some of you, however, you go through the drive-thru at Taco Villa and you find out you have to pay 40 cents for your cup and all you wanted was water, and you go, oh, I'm not going to argue. I'm just going to take it. Here's my 40 cents. And others would have said, oh, really? How about, okay, I know you're doing that because of the cup, not the water. I brought my own bucket. Can you just put it in this and give it to me for free? Huh? I'm not suggesting you try that, but the thought has crossed my mind, all right? So, argumentativeness, verbal aggression, different things. Argumentative folks have a tendency to be lower in verbal aggression because they'd rather argue about it and points of view. Now, I will tell you, you have to understand when you talk about argumentativeness, you're not talking about being a jerk or a crank. You know, most of the time when I have students come to me and they say, would you write me a recommendation letter? And I'll say, yes. You want me to put on there that you're argumentative? Well, probably not, because most people don't understand the context with which that comes. And most people say, well, I don't want that on my resume. Hey, I'm very argumentative. Oh, good. Find a job somewhere else.
We don't need you here, all right? So it's more of the concept, do you like to debate, rotate ideas, probe ideas, and see if they hold water, or do you just not like to do that? And again, it doesn't mean you're a good person if you do or a bad person if you don't. It just is a predisposition. It says trait here. I would say maybe trait-like. We'll talk to our psychologists in here to see if that's actually something you're born with or not. Although nature, nurture. All right. I want us to look at a little bit of a few examples of some research. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but if you want the slides, I can send it to you later. Infante in 81 found that argumentative individuals are seen as more dynamic communicators, as more credible. All right. In 82, higher reports of GPA. Does that ring a bell with anybody in here getting extra credit? Oh, yes, it does. All right. GPA students that were a little bit higher in argumentative skills. Infante and Gordon in 87, high argumentative people are seen as more independent-minded. Infante, Chandler, Rudd in 1989, people in nonviolent marriages are more argumentative than those in violent marriages. Think about it, people. When push comes to shove, do you argue or you start throwing things or bringing out the weapons? You see what I'm saying? Kind of an interesting concept. Several other researchers, high argumentatives, are seen as more competent communicators. Recent research, Rancer and Infante at kind of in the last few years, started going to inner cities and teaching inner city children how to argue instead of physically fight. Let's learn how to argue rather than fight. And I thought, what a cool inner city program to try to teach people communication skills that don't end up in drive-by shootings. Does that make sense? All right. There are some things that you may want to think about. One of my favorite researchers, I just have to talk to you about him. He's really humble. I can tell you he's the most humble person I know. He did a research project one time, and he thought, well, if all this argumentative stuff is good, well, maybe it would show up in the classroom. Like for those of you that are graduate students and you're teaching assistants, maybe you would like to have a more argumentative teacher, and that would be good, and it would give you more affect. Affect is liking towards the teacher and the subject matter and that sort of thing. And so that's what this humble researcher was trying to find. Fascinating. And power use, what do you do in your classroom to make people turn in their papers on time or whatever? One of the interesting things in the results of this study, though, were at least was not what the researcher expected. And I know him well. I've talked to him a lot. Higher TA argumentativeness showed up and had a tendency to be related with lower student affect. So when the teacher was more argumentative, the students reported lower levels of affect, which means liking for the class, liking for the teacher, or whatever. Interestingly enough, lower teacher argumentativeness was related to more student perceptions that they would use more power in their classes because they weren't arguing. So if we're not going to argue, then it's just my way or the highway, that type of thing, all right? So that was kind of an interesting thing. Even Infante and Rancer said people that are highly argumentative, they really get excited to be around other people that are highly argumentative. They like it. It's somebody like me. And people that are low argumentative like to be around other people that are low argumentative, all right? So then you say, well, okay, how can I do this argumentative research if sometimes it has a tendency to be positive, but other times maybe not, all right? Maybe not. Well, you know, you can be a really good arguer, but you could still have this be part of your characteristics. I really love the one on the left. Don't you like that one? Top left. Oh, I just can't wait. I put it on my list of things to do. I want to go say that to somebody. I'm just waiting for the right moment, all right? So you could have really great argument skills, but you might not still be effective at civil discourse, even if your argumentative skills are good. And so I wanted to explore one more alternative in the time that we have left, and that is to look a little bit past that. What happens if you have great argument skills, but you still aren't accused of having civil discourse? Well, I have found in my short pilgrimage upon this earth that I can be right and not well received. I can have all the logic, data, argument in the world, and the other person is not persuaded, and the other person thinks I'm being incivil. Well, maybe part of it is good argument skills, but maybe part of it goes a little bit further than that. Kenneth Burke is a noted rhetorical theorist, those of you that study rhetoric. And Kenneth Burke said this, and I thought it was really interesting. The progress of human enlightenment can go no further than picturing people not as vicious, but as mistaken. You know those pictures I showed you at the beginning of our time together? That's not what was being assumed in those pictures, was it? Fascinating. So if I need to change the way I think about people, the second alternative might be, first alternative, work on my argument skills and learn how to argue and learn how to do it well. And next week you're going to hear a lot more about that. Second thing might be to consider what is civil rhetoric. Viri bonus descendi paritas. Well, what in the world is that? Well, Quintilian and Cato thought it was kind of a good thing to say. That is, someone that practices civil rhetoric is a good person speaking well. Wow. Speaking well. Well, you know, that kind of goes a little bit even more further than your argument skills. What kind of character do you have? Dr. Hughes and I were talking about that just before. Do you have goodwill towards the other person? Do you have eloquence in how you shared what you said, or blunt brutalness? All right. So I think part of an alternative to incivil rhetoric is learning how to maybe speak the truth in love. Maybe. Whoops, I blanked it out. Kenneth Burke also said this, and I thought this was deep, deep, deep. You can persuade a person only insofar as you can talk their language by speech, gesture, tonality, order, attitude, image, idea, identifying your ways with that person's ways, even if you're trying to persuade them. Even. And in fact, I perceive you're religious people. Let's talk about this unknown God, right? The same type of thing. Kenneth Burke, and he may not have been the first one, but he came up with a concept, or he talks a lot about a concept that's called identification. Have you ever said something about your friends and say, "Oh yeah, I identify with that. I so identify with that"? What is identification? Identification is when you learn, or when you feel a kinship to the other person. I overlap. I identify with what you're doing. You may not agree with everybody's religious preferences, but you might say, I identify with you on this. I identify. It's more than a sympathy for. I'm a feeling with you. It's not even empathy. It's a deeper thing that says, well, I'll tell you what. I'll show you a picture of it. Is there some serious identification going on here? Oh, yes, there is. All right, and I know all of you students in this room today want to dress like your professors, don't you? Yes, you do. All right, do you look at people in your life that have made a big mark on you and you think, when I grow up, I want to be like that? I'm still doing that, and I have gray hair, and I think when I grow up, I want to be more like that person because they show me things that I need to know, and they show me ways of being with other people that I need to know. And so you can see some serious identification going on here. Identification goes even further, though, into something that I think is pretty deep, and Burke talks about this as well. Consubstantiation. Consubstantiation. Well, let's break it down. Con, you're in jail. No, that's not what that means. Consubstantiation. Consubstantiation is sharing of substance. Sharing of substance. In a religious perspective, you might hear debates over transubstantiation. Okay? Consubstantiation is sharing of substance. So you have two different people with two different ideas about whatever it is you're talking about, separate, but then you find that there's places as you Venn diagram with that person. You overlap with them a little bit. I share substance with you on this. Maybe not this, but this. All right? And so when you see people that have been together for a long time and they share substance, kind of like what you do at Lubbock Christian in terms of your purpose. All right? Then you run into cross people like this, people from different areas, different walks of life, who share substance because they're veterans and they spent time together and they had a belief in something that was bigger than both of them or three of them, and they got along because they shared substance. They identified with one another. And I found the coolest picture of identification and consubstantiation. It's the coolest ever. If you can reach this, you can practice civil discourse. You ready? Some of you in here would lean more towards one of those person's political affiliation, and you would say, get away from that other person. Do you know who that is? And others of you in here would say, get away from that person. Do you know who that is? Did you know that President George Bush and Michelle Obama actually have a good friendship relationship? I found an article on this, and it blew me away. How in the world could you get that from those political parties? And I thought, if we're going to learn civil discourse, can we learn it like this? Does that mean they agree on everything? No, probably not. But does that mean when they're around each other, they scratch each other's eyes out? Well, not in this case. Not in this case. So as we wrap this up, we're looking at, okay, I live in a world where I may not be able to change the context. I may not be able to do anything about those contextual things that surround uncivil discourse, but I can make a difference to try to give more civil discourse in the middle of the storm. So you have this uncivil discourse, this characterized by this. And by the way, the bottom right-hand corner is a communication studies professor, I'm sorry to say. But that's a communication studies professor. Maybe they need to do some more graduate work, all right? But this is not what we want. What we want, and I'll close with this, with civil discourse, we want something that looks like this. Do you know who that person is on the right-hand side of the screen? Shimon Peres. Do you know who that is next to him? Not Merkel, but Angela Merkel. That's the German chancellor, prime minister. Do you see the significance of that picture? Oh my word. Look at this other one up at the top left-hand corner. Aside from the guy with the cool sunglasses, the next guy over bending over, do you know who that is? That is the Prime Minister of Japan. Do you know who he's talking to? U.S. World War II vets. Do you know where they are? They're in Pearl Harbor. This, people, is civil discourse. This is civil discourse. Practice your rhetorical sensitivity to somebody else. That doesn't mean change your mind. That just means change your rhetorical sensitivity. Get yourself better with your arguments, and then get yourself better with your relationships. That is how we achieve civil discourse. Thank you for your attention.
We want to take just a few minutes and open it up for a discussion and for questions and answers. And so I will open up and do you have questions for Dr. Roach?
What time does class start?
I have a question about the Roach research. That was on TAs. Can you speculate on what a similar study of full professors would reveal?
That's a fascinating thing. In fact, comm studies people, there's some research for you right there. You know, there's some similarities between teaching assistants, graduate teaching assistants and professors, but professors have oldness and they have experience that sometimes TAs don't have. TAs have freshness and realness, and I know what Snapchat is that professors don't have. All right, so you see that different teachers have different perspectives. For teaching assistants, authority in the classroom is a scary place. What if I tell them to do something and they don't do it? For professors, they don't worry about that as much because it's like, oh, really? Is that all you're going to say? Sit down. Whatever. They've been dealing with it for years. I suspect, though, that some of the trends would be there. What I found in this is that if your professor is argumentative with you as a student, there's a power differential that makes you as a student at a disadvantage, doesn't it? So technically, as a student, you think, well, I can argue with you. You're wrong on that. But you think, well, this is a professor in my grade, and I can't win. And so I think there's some of that would go on with that, and I think it would show up for professors in as much as it would for TAs as well. So professors that say, let's reason one with another on this. Well, how about this? Well, how about this? Well, you said this, but how about that? I think that would be perceived well, but if a professor's out to win a debate with the students, because of their power differential, they're going to win every time, or at least the students are going to be nervous about taking that on. And I think that's true with it. Well, maybe less with the TA. It's like, oh, heavens, you graduated last year and you're my teacher? Well, yeah. Well, I know you. I've played Frisbee golf with you. You probably haven't played Frisbee golf with your professor, because they're old and they don't know how to throw it. So that was a long answer to your question. I think it would be interesting to tease that out. I have, in some of those studies, I know this guy, there were some studies on teacher influence in the classroom, and there were radical differences between TAs and professors and how they were perceived by the students. But that was a little bit past the argumentative. Okay. Sean?
Other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
So you talked about how we've had discourse in the past. And with your study in communications and the trends that communication has taken, how long, or can you speculate on, do you think the world is going to come to this idea of uncivil discourse quicker, or is it going to take a longer time? How do you see this playing out?
How do we see traveling towards uncivil discourse playing out, right? I think as long as there's some people that say, I'm not going to do it that way, then we have hope. If we all get to where we're going to bite and scratch just like everybody else, then we're no different than anybody else. And frankly, I think Jesus calls us to not be that way. Now, he did confront, did he not? Sometimes he turned over tables. But other times he said, let's go to the bigger question. Let's go to the bigger question. Let me talk to you. You're different than me, but let me talk to you. Let's talk about that. I think that's a charge that we have at Lubbock Christian. I think that's a charge that we have as Christians. We're going to have to make the difference. If it gets to the point where people's teeth are on edge as much or to a certain degree without that, then you get the French Revolution. You get AD 70 where they tore Jerusalem so far down you couldn't even see one rock stacked on the other. And so if that happens, if people get to where they're not doing that, do some research just for fun. Do some research on what was going on in 69 AD. Oh, my word. The Jews hated the Romans. They hated Herod. They hated a bunch of stuff. They fought with themselves as much as they fought with the Romans. In fact, one of the reasons that Jerusalem fell is because the Jews were fighting each other while they were trying to fend off the Romans. In fact, they burned up each other's food supplies. So when we get to that point, and we have the interpersonal conflicts, but we have intra within a group, we're weak. We're weak and we're fall. But frankly, I'm of hope because I see people in here that say, I'm not going to do it that way. I'm going to have my values, and I will draw a line. But I'm going to treat you with dignity and respect when I do that. And I think as Christians, we're called to do that. Excellent question. I wish I knew the answer. All I know is that no matter what, God rules. That's what I know.
What about a situation to where one person on this side of the table is practicing uncivil discourse and the person on this side of the table is attending civil?
So what if you have a room and there's a civil and an uncivil right at the same table, and the civil keeps being civil and the uncivil keeps being uncivil? I guess the first thing I would say is, how do you argue? Do you argue like a golden retriever, or do you argue like the razor slime monster from Naboo? How do you argue? Because part of that has to do with your relationship. I think there's a point at which the soft answer turns away wrath. I've seen other instances where the soft answer was perceived as weakness and they went for the throat. So I think sometimes you show examples that you can still be firm, but it's kind of like, can I reach everybody? I can reach most people
I've been humbled by soft answers I've received before, and I'm thinking, ooh, I behaved badly. I need to get better. There's been other times where I've been so nice to somebody and they're still scratching my eyes out. In fact, I've been very nice to somebody and they started an argument while I was complimenting them. I'm thinking, how do you do that? You did so well at this. Well, but you did so well. But you. I'm going, where does that come from? So I would suggest, as you know, we do the best we can and then go from there. Yes, Dr.
Thank you for
Fredberg.
being here, Dr. Roach. I appreciate it. I've noticed within the last week or two in political rhetoric that it's denigrated to the use of memes quite a lot. And a recent meme that's popped up is called the NPC, the non-playing character meme. I don't know if any of y'all have seen this, but it grays people's faces out on the memes and makes them all look identical. So where you have those pictures of people in a crowd fighting, and it just blends them all out. And it strikes me, I was thinking about that in your comment about quintillion, which I think probably also comes from Aristotle earlier. But whereas rhetoric talks more about logos, the argument, it seems that you can't even get there unless there is something already present. And you mentioned them as character and goodwill, which is, I think, both an inward and outward disposition. One, to remain calm, the outward disposition of goodwill to be open. Do you have any thoughts on the relative priority of ethos, pathos, and logos, and what that might say to us about the way we train our students, or how we go about encouraging them? Where to begin?
Ethos, pathos, and logos. Let's go for another semester or 3 hours. That is a wonderful comment. Well, let me see if I can address this, and then I think I've got to be respectful of your time. Wow, how do we train people on logos? Logos is logic, but from what I understand, like in John 1:1, in the beginning was the logos. Logos, I think, in the Greek mind was also the cosmic order. Logos brings order, logic, order to the chaos of the waters in Genesis, the chaos of the waters. So I think we hunger for logos. We hunger for order in our lives. Anybody that's in a life where they're out of control and their life is spinning, it's not a fun place to be. And so we crave that. So teaching people how to logos. I think next week's presentation, they're going to do a lot about raise your argument. And I think that'll be a really, really cool session you won't want to miss. So I think that's there. But if we lose our humanitas, our humanity, I can be really good at arguing. But if I'm a jerk, or if I'm not perceived as listening, and I have a tendency to be very pathetic. And when I talk, I get very fired up. Some people might perceive that as aggressive. To me, it's just like, oh, I'm so excited, you're wrong, but let me tell you about it. As opposed to, well, you appear to be wrong, but let us consider it. I think there's different personalities. I hope God can use a Peter as well as he can use a John on Patmos, where he says, my children. And Peter saying, whip out the sword. And I love Peter. I'm more like him. But I thought, study your Bible characters and look at their ego, their pathos and their logos and their ethos. Look at that, and you'll find yourself there, and you'll find that Jesus used every single one of them, regardless of their dispositions. Now, can we train? Yes. Can I know what my limitations are? Yes. It would be good for me to know what my pathos limitations are, and what my credibility limitations are, and what my logic limitations are, and I can get better at that. But that comes from the heart to want to do that, I think. Oh,
I don't know if I addressed your question or not because that was a big one. So, Sean, let me hand it back to you. I perceive that we have some classes that are going to start pretty soon, and so I want to be respectful of that. Thank you for coming out because you care about civil discourse. Thank you.
Again, thank you for Dr. Roach for coming today, and enjoy the rest of your day.